Hey everyone, welcome to another section of notes. It's Mr. Smith, your 8th grade U.S. history teacher here at Emma Donna Middle School. And today we'll be covering Chapter 1, Section 2, Part 2's notes. And in our notes today, we're going to finish our discussion about what is a culture and what was the culture of different Native American groups living in North America. So let's get started. All right, I'm not going to ask you to go out of your way to watch CNN Student News. If you'd like to watch CNN Student News from today, come ask me how to find it and I'll gladly show you. But again, you're probably watching this video because you were absent, so I'm not going to ask you to go out of your way and go find it. Or 2, you're watching these notes because you want to prepare for a quiz or a test that's upcoming, and I don't need you to go rewatch those CNN Student News because they're not going to be necessarily tested on your test or quiz. In class, we watched CNN Student News, of course, like always, but then we worked on about 20 minutes worth of notes. We'll get to what we're looking for in those notes, but again, we're continuing this discussion of what is a culture and what was the culture like of different Native Americans in different regions where they were geographically located, or cultural areas where they practiced the same type of cultural aspects, so music, language, art, beliefs, all those things in the same area geographically. Then we worked on a mapping activity. I'll modify that for you in just a minute. And then we worked on a your culture paragraph write. So again, the your culture is not going to be a race response. Different. It's going to be a paragraph write. So using your own opinion to back up the claims that you're making in your writing. All right, so these essential questions should look very familiar to the essential questions that we looked at yesterday. They are, how did other Native American groups live in the Americas? So again, we're not talking about those 3 major civilizations, the Aztec, the Mayas, and the Incas. We're talking about those different Native American groups and where they lived and how did they live in the Americas. Question 2 is, what was the culture of these different Native American groups in these different regions like? And what is a culture, and how, again, does it define what a society is or what a civilization is like? By the end of our notes today, you should be able to identify and explain the culture and locations of Native American groups that lived in North America. All right, so on your tree map, the left-hand column or left-hand branch where it says Far West or Far West Native Americans, anything that's in color, you're going to need to make sure that you have written down. Again, white is not a color. It's good information to have, but you do not necessarily need to have it in your notes. So on the left-hand side, Far West Native Americans or Far West Tree Branch, everything in yellow is going to be written there. To give you some background information about what the Far West is, the Far West is distinctly different from the Far North that we talked about yesterday and the Northwest Native Americans that we talked about yesterday. The Far West weather, so the living conditions weather-wise, had cold winters, kind of like the Far North, but not quite as cold, and it wasn't icy all year round. And they also had hot desert-like summers. So the Native Americans that we're talking about living in the Far West are Native Americans that lived in parts of California, Nevada, and Idaho. So if you see on this picture, the far left section near the California, near the Pacific Ocean, that's where we're talking about, these Far West Native Americans. Now, what made this Native American culture different from other Native American groups is the type of food they ate. So if you remember, the Far North ate things like seals, whales, and different game like that. The Native Americans in the Far West are eating things like small game, so like foxes, rabbits. They're also eating some type of oceanic animal or animals from the ocean, like fish, because they are so close to the ocean. But they're not hunting whales, they're not hunting seals, and things like that. So their diet or the food that they're eating is distinctly different. They're also eating berries, which were more common around in California, not so common in the Far North, which makes them different from that Far North tribe. Housing, also distinctly different from the Far North that used the igloos, or the Northwest Native Americans that had those long houses with the totem poles. The Far West Native American housing basically depended on the resources that were around them. And so many times what these Native Americans did is they dug basically a big pit so that they could live down in the pit, and then they constructed these big cone-shaped housing units to protect them from the rain, the snow, the sleet, and different weather conditions like that. It also would keep them cool in the summertime, and basically protect them from that hot desert-like heat. So they lived in these pit houses with these cone-shaped roofs that were covered in bark over the top of them. Some Native American names or tribes that lived in these housing conditions and lived in these cultural areas or the regions of the far west include the Pomo and the Winton. So different Native American groups living in this area. All right, moving slightly to the east from those far west Native Americans, you have the Southwest. So similar to the far west, these Native Americans are also going to live in desert-like areas. But instead of having hot desert summers like the far west Native Americans do, these Southwest Native Americans have hot desert summer time all the time. And so the Native Americans that we're talking about lived in parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and also the southern parts of Utah and Colorado. Now, because there was so much desert and there's so much heat all the time, Native Americans had to be creative with how can we live in this harsh desert-like climate? How can we live in these crazy hot conditions where there's barely any water? And what they came up with is that they needed to create a surplus, just like we talked about 2 days ago on our notes, where they had to create or grow extra food so that when it was hot in the summertime and there wasn't enough food to find, basically berries and roots and things for, they had to have all that extra food stored up. On top of also having enough food stored up for the entire year, these farmers also had to collect the rainwater, because if you've ever been to Arizona, it is very hot and very dry. And so what you have to do is you have to collect or basically preserve any water that you can. So when you have no rain for months and months and months and months, you have a water source of some kind and you're able to survive and be able to drink water so you can stay hydrated and things like that. Again, very different type of living style or culture that the Southwest Native Americans have to endure that other Native Americans do not, because they have water sources on a constant basis. The far north, ice. All you have to do is just melt that and you have water. The Northwest, it's constantly raining. The far west also had rain, also had snow. The Southwest Native Americans, not so much. It is a hot, dry climate. So their culture or their way of living is distinctly unique. What's also very unique about this Native American region or this cultural area of the Southwest is that Native Americans or the Pueblo people actually lived in something called an adobe house. And so what adobe is basically it's a brick-like material, so kind of like almost like a clay that gets hardened by the sunlight, and it creates basically your house that you live in. And so if you look in this picture, you see what adobe housing looks like. So you have these Native Americans basically living on top of each other using these clay-formed houses as their means of basically protecting them from the insane desert heat. And what's actually really interesting and really cool about these Native Americans is lots of times women had rights. So ladies, if you're watching this video, you had lots of rights in these Native American cultures. And what's interesting is because the houses were built on top of each other, if a Native American woman was upset at her husband, she could literally throw his stuff outside of her house, have it tumble down past every other Native American house as it's making this way down. And when basically the husband or the significant other comes home, they would see their stuff thrown all across this adobe housing platform down the hill, and they would have to shamefully collect it as they made their way back up to their house and basically apologize to their spouse. So interesting that women had so much power and control in this Southwest society. Native Americans that lived in this area, so some names of Native American tribes in this area are the Hopi and also the Zuni. So far we've talked about the far west and we've talked about the Southwest. Moving on. All right, the Great Plains. These Native Americans live in a substantial area of land. We're not talking about the Northwest that lived in that little sliver from southern Alaska down basically to northern California, or the far west that lived basically in California. Take a look at this map. That lime green area stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains, so from that blue river line all the way to that gray, that lime green, that's the area of the Great Plains. That's where the Native Americans that we're going to be talking about right now, that's where they lived. And what's basically distinctly different from the Native Americans of the Great Plains compared to other regions is that the Great Plains is a very fertile, soil-rich area. So instead of trying to harvest the rain and make sure you have pots that can conserve your rainwater and your crops, these Native Americans, the land was so fertile, they could literally almost plant all year and not have to worry about the rain coming or worry about their crops. And what happened lots of times in these Native American villages where this fertile soil is women, like we've talked about before, planted the crops. So women had a huge role in making sure that their families were provided for, making sure that their community was provided for by growing these crops for their family and their community. And what they grew were things like corn, beans, and squash. And this is the Native American tribes that really utilized, because they live so close to the rivers, irrigation. So they're digging those channels from these major rivers like the Missouri River and the Mississippi River, and they're basically watering their crops with this irrigation system, making sure that their families and their communities are able to survive. So very different lifestyle from the Southwest Native Americans. Also, men would go out and hunt buffaloes. So no longer are we talking about Native Americans that are hunting for fish. They're not hunting for whales, for seals. These Native Americans are hunting for buffaloes, groundhogs, and things like that in order to provide for their family. Housing style, also very distinctly different. If you've ever seen a Western film, almost any Western film, you're talking about the Great Plains, where these Native Americans lived in teepees, or they basically dug pits in order to protect themselves from the wind. And what's interesting is lots of times these Native Americans, even though, yes, they did use irrigation and they did plant down roots as a tribe, many of these Native American males actually used these teepees because they were able to deconstruct or tear down so that they could go and follow those buffalo herds across the Great Plains. Then they could kill the buffalo and then bring it back to their tribe as a meat source. Native Americans from this area include Native Americans such as the Lakota and also the Cheyenne. So again, as we're talking about these cultures and these Native American groups and these different cultural areas or regions, we're seeing how vastly different these Native Americans lived. Doesn't make them better or worse than the other one. It just means that they had a culture and they had a society with structure. That's very important to remember when we start talking about European colonization, because these Native Americans had civilizations. They had civilized, organized governments. They had family units. It's just going to be different from the Europeans that are going to come later on. All right, and I believe it's our last area or region or cultural group for today. It's going to be the Eastern Woodlands. These Native Americans also lived in a vast area that basically stretched from southern Canada around the Great Lakes, so around Indiana, around Michigan, we're talking about this area, all the way to New York and Maine, all the way down to Virginia. These Native Americans are going to be hunters and gatherers. They're also going to have set up civilizations or societies, so they're going to have tribes located in central areas, but lots of these Native Americans are going to be looking for berries, wild berries. They're going to be looking for nuts growing off trees and things like that. The Native Americans that live close to river systems, so like the Ohio River and the Great Lakes, they're going to be hunting for animals like fish and different things like that. What makes the Eastern Woodlands so unique is the Iroquois and Algonquin tribes that lived in this region, specifically the Iroquois. Although the Algonquian have their own history that's just as important, but the Iroquois we really find interesting because the Iroquois are going to be these 5 distinct clans or these groups that were related to one another. So if it helps you, think about Black Panther. You have the different tribes in Wakanda, and what these tribes did is they kind of worked together. But what the Iroquois did is they had these clans, and basically the women were the ones that chose the sachem or the clan chief, and then the clan chief would plot against other Iroquois clans and try to take their land and take their possessions. Kind of like in Black Panther when T'Chaka and M'Baku are fighting for ownership of the king. That's essentially what these 5 different distinct Iroquois clans were trying to do. But what they realized, kind of also like in Black Panther, when M'Baku realizes, man, I need to help T'Challa, these clans realize that they can't fight against each other and they have to work together in order to create a unified government or a unified tribe. And so what these clans do is they're going to form something called a League of the Iroquois. And it's going to essentially be like our Senate or like our government. It's going to create laws, and it's also going to enforce those laws and keep the peace. So again, Native Americans are not these uncivilized people wandering around half naked across North America. They had very specific roles for family structures. They had governments with laws, as the case in point of this League of the Iroquois. So they are very much civilized people living inside of North America. And I want you to keep this in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to this in just a couple of days and talk about why is it important that we knew these different cultures of these different Native American groups. Why is that such a big deal? And we'll get to that in just a little bit. All right, so I'm not going to have you work on this mapping activity, because the mapping activity, I don't want you to forget or mess up. Just come see me or a classmate and check out their map, and they will gladly, or all gladly, help you make sure that you get all the information mapped out that you need. All right, this is the part that you can do. So on a scrap sheet of paper or a separate line sheet of paper or on the back of your notes. Not on the back of your notes, because you're going to turn this in. So on a separate line sheet of paper, I want you to answer these questions. What is your culture? So think back to what we talked about yesterday. A culture is based on your belief system, the different activities that you do. So whether you're in sports, you like to draw, what is your family life like, things like that. What is your culture? And how would you describe your culture? So what do you like to eat? What foods do you eat? What music do you listen to? Sports do you enjoy? Things like that. Beliefs that you have about the world. What is your culture, and how would you describe your culture? Then lastly, how do you think people think about you based on your culture? So think kind of like the Disney stereotypes. That's what I like to call it. Disney focuses on stereotypes of certain cultures, or like the cool kids. You have the punk rock kids, you have the athletic kids, and different things like that. You have the artsy kids. How do you think, based on what people know about you and your culture, how do you think people think about you based on your culture? I know I'm asking a lot, but I want you to actually take this seriously and think about it. So what is your culture? How would you describe the culture that you have? And how do you think that other people, when they see you or perceive you, how do they think about you based on your culture? Take some time to answer these questions. Until next time, Mr. Smith out.